So, welcome to this Choosing Your Tech talk. It's this dev talk that I've been talking about doing for a few months now, I think, and I finally decided to commit to it and do it. So, this talk is really about choosing the technology for your game project. It could probably be extended to other projects as well, but mostly focusing on game development. So, do you use a game engine? Do you write your own engine? And also things like using like image editors or um, Git GUIs or whatever. I think that this applies to all of those. It mostly focuses on the the larger parts, the game engine, but I think it applies the most. So, whoops. So yeah, technology is a tool, and like all tools, you want to be using the right one for the right job. You don't want to be trying to use a hammer when you really need a screwdriver, and that's the same for technology for the applications that you're using to develop your project. And there can definitely be the wrong tools for your project. Some are obvious, like if you are making a first-person shooter, you probably don't want to be using RPG Maker. Yes, that's obvious, but I think that there are other like text choices that could be just as bad that are not nearly as obvious. Before we really get into the talk, though, I want to put up this big disclaimer. I don't really know what I'm doing. I have very limited experience. I've rented one game, and I'll go into my experience here in a moment. And so this is like just one perspective, and I think that if you really want to learn more about like what technologies you should be using for your project, you should really go out and explore that, and get other people's advice and not just listen to me. So yeah, just putting that out there. I really don't know what I'm saying. So yeah. So who am I? My name is Jason, and I have been doing. Well, I'll go down the list. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science. I worked right out of school. I worked at a tech company for 3 years doing software development, not games related, and then and on the side, I was doing hobby game development, and eventually I got up the courage to leave that company and go indie, where I was working on Korea, and I worked on Korea for 7 years. Started off as a small 6-month project that turned into 7 years, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Yeah. Yeah, at the tech company, I was working on doing desktop management via virtualization. So it's like not really applicable to games whatsoever, but still kind of interesting. So yeah, Korea's technology. What did I choose for that? Well, I didn't really put a lot of thought into it. I like I said, I went into the project thinking it was another hobby project, 6 months at most is what I told everyone. Um, and it was really to build up an application, to build up my like portfolio. Because I wanted to get a job in the game industry, and I had applied right out of school to a lot of game companies and never got a response. So I'm like, okay, well maybe I need to have a better portfolio. So let's write my own game engine. And I was force-fed object-oriented programming in school, and so SFML looked very appealing to me. And I was using Python at work along with C++, so it was like a very similar tech stack that I was doing on my day job, so it just kind of made sense, try to reduce that overhead cost. And what I didn't really know is that I was going to be working with that technology for the next 7 years, and if I had known that, I would have made different choices. Yeah, lots of different choices, and we'll get into that a little bit more later whenever we get to the whole like custom engine thing and thinking about that. But yeah, besides using my own custom engine, the other tech I use for Korea is Visual Studio. I upgraded over the years, so I'm now on like VS 2017. I've stuck with Sublime Text pretty much throughout the entire thing, along with SourceTree and Slack. Those are great tools to use. I've tried other text editors like Atom and VS Code, and I just keep coming back to Sublime Text. So it's awesome. So yeah, I am like the reason I decided to do this talk is that I started thinking about future projects. I'm working on designing a new project right now, prototyping it, exploring it, and I've been thinking, what technology should I be using for that? So I've been asking myself a lot of questions, and since I stream regularly, I'm also asked kind of the same questions. What technology should I use for my game? Should I use Unity, or should I use my own game engine? Whatever. I get asked those questions a lot. And asking those questions is really good. But I also think that sometimes people don't really look at the entire picture whenever they're asking those questions. They're just like considering one or two things for it. And there's a lot of questions that you should be asking whenever, especially for like the game engine. If you're using Unity or Unreal or trying to do a custom engine. And a lot of those questions only you can really answer because you are the one with all the context. I don't know anything about your project. So yeah, you need to be asking yourself that, or these questions that I'm going to be posing to you. So like, first and foremost, what is this project? What are you doing? Like, one of the biggest questions is this a hobby project or a commercial project? For hobby projects, the tech answers are going to be very, very different than if it's a commercial one. If it's a hobby project, do what you want. Like, if you want to write your own game engine, then do it. Like, why does it matter? There are no restrictions. If you want to pose some restrictions or, goals, objectives, then that's great. And that should help you answer a lot of questions. Like, if you want to write your own game engine, then obviously, like, and that's the purpose of the hobby project, then yeah, that's great. Then you already have the answer. If you're wanting to try to make a game quickly, like you don't want to spend a lot of time on it, then that also should answer a lot of questions. Like, you probably should use an existing game engine. And we'll get into that, like game engines versus custom engines later on in the talk. So yeah, for hobby, I think you kind of free yourself of a lot of these like questions, and they don't really matter unless you like make that decision that they matter, and then you should really know. For commercial games though, which I don't know how many people here, are actually making commercial games and are like, what tech should I use? But for commercial games, I think it matters a lot more. This is something that I wish I had spent more time thinking about for Korea's development, because originally it was more of a hobby. and it then kind of converted over into a commercial game, and I made decisions early on that really hurt the commercial aspect, like portability. But yeah, I'll be getting into that more here. So like project scoped, or scope. If you're doing a smaller game, then you might want to avoid learning something new. You want to be as quick as possible, unless it's a hobby. Um, so a lot of this stuff is really for commercial games, unless you decide that this is important to you, like I said. So yeah, smaller scope means that typically you want to avoid the overhead of learning something new. It takes time to learn something, and if you're going to spend 2 months learning something and then spend 3 months working on it, that's a lot of overhead for such a small project. Whereas on the other side of things, if you have a very large game, then it might really be worth investing, trying to find and learn the right technology, even if there is some overhead, and learning that thing. So, if you're working on a game for 7 years, then it might be worth learning something new. For Korea, I had considered using Lua, and I kind of wrote it off because I was like, you know what? I already know Python. I don't really want to learn uh, a new scripting language just for this small little project. Maybe I'll do that later down the road, but I just want to try to keep this small. But there's this thing called optimism and scope creep. They're friends. Well, kind of. So, programmers and just game developers in general, I think, are very optimistic. You're like, yeah, this is only going to take 6 months to make. 7 years later, woo, 1.0. For some people, it really is like that. But yeah, and part of the reason that can happen is because of scope creep, where you come up with the minimal set of the game, and then you're like, oh, you know what? It would be really cool to add this other feature, and then that leads to another thing, and so on. Or I think like uh, it might not be what people typically consider scope creep or feature creep, but like even expanding the like going from hobby to commercial, like that is it's essentially scope creep, where suddenly you have to worry about a much larger subset of problems than you did before. For a hobby project, who cares about performance? Who cares about it running on other platforms necessarily, unless that matters to you. But once you go commercial, you have to think about like, oh, okay, what's the minimal requirements for running this game, and are we making sure that we're hitting our 30 FPS or 60 FPS or whatever you're targeting, and lots of other things you have to consider, polishing and whatnot. And so if you think that the game might be turned into a commercial game, then maybe you really should be thinking about that up front, and using that to help decide what technologies you should use. So another thing to think about for choosing your technology is the community support around it. I think this is one of the things that a lot of people don't really consider up front is, what's the community for this a particular product, like Unity or Unreal Engine or whatever, Godot. Those can make a huge impact on the development, because the more people that are using it means the more likely that someone else has ran into the exact same problems that you are going to be running into. you run into some error message, or you're trying to figure out how to do some particular thing with the system or the application, and you go to Google and you type it in. What's the likelihood of you getting results for that particular thing? And that really matters, or that really depends on the community around that particular product. So yeah, community, and you can usually be able to figure that out fairly easily just by like going to the forums, seeing how big the forums are, doing some basic searches for like how to do certain things within the application, and you would get a good sense of it, I think. So yeah, again, is this right? Yeah. I think I meant to add more here, but I left it. Performance, it can be a really important thing for commercial games. You really don't want your game lagging. And so if performance does matter to you, then certain, like, if this is mostly important for the game engines or your own engine, then that might matter. If you're making a first-person shooter, then using something like Java might not be a good idea. You might want to consider a more powerful engine. I know a lot of people. I've seen a lot of people start, and this kind of also goes back to the whole scope creep thing. They start making a game in some tools that support making games for you, but then their scope kind of expands, and they end up kind of struggling with that engine, and also hitting the like a performance like ceiling, essentially, where they're trying to do so much stuff within that engine that it really doesn't support. Way back whenever I first started doing game development or just like messing around with it, I was using RPG Maker 2K. So this was like 2001, 2002, and it had like a preset menu and a preset battle system, and you couldn't really do much with it, but that didn't mean people didn't try to. And one of the things that I actually spent the majority of my time trying to do in RPG Maker is not making a huge story or whatever, it was making menus, trying to make custom menus within this RPG Maker. And so I had this like super complex system set up where like the numbers on the screen, which represented the player's health or their like gold, was actually like other like NPCs that had their frames changed based off of those variables that were set in the game, because you couldn't actually have a custom UI. And I spent like hours and days working on this stuff, where if you have an actual like scripting language or just a real game, that's trivial to do. But like, so I was trying to do this really complex stuff and this game engine that just had too many limitations. And I think that's a good indicator that you should probably just move on. So it's kind of performance, kind of not. So yeah, and I've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but you also want to be thinking about the future of the project. That's something I've been thinking a lot about for my new project. And also for Korea, originally I was only thinking I was going to be working on the game for 6 months, and it turned out to be 7 years. So it's like, what does this support longevity look like? Portability, re-releases, future projects. So that stuff is actually really important, particularly, and I'll get to it more whenever you're kind of thinking about your game engine versus like custom engine. So you want to, if you are wanting to be able to like re-release a game in the future, it's kind of a become a very common thing to do like anniversary releases, 10 years or 15 years, you re-release on consoles, especially console games, I think, do this. Because usually PC games, people can still play them. But even, Blizzard is now re-releasing some of their games on uh, their platform. So there's like new Warcraft 3 game coming out. And they just did StarCraft remake, I believe. Yeah. Um, and so that's also, like if you're wanting to be able to reuse that code or those engines, then it's important to think about, um, your technology that you're using. Is it going to still be usable in 10 years from now? Or 5 years? If you're still, like, if this is a game that you're running as a game as a service, then, your support longevity is going to be very long. 5, 10 years. Um, and then also for future projects, maybe you want to try reusing the same thing. So um, you can think of it as an investment not just for that game, but also for future games if you're trying to learn something. So if you're using RPG Maker and you're just like, I don't know if I'm really ready to move on. Like I'm still able to get stuff done with this game maker, and it's working for this game. It's like, okay, yeah, but what about your next game? Maybe your next game you will want to make even more complex. So it might be worthwhile just like kind of biting the bullet and spinning that overhead to learn it, learn a new game engine or whatever, so that way your future projects you will be able to develop faster. So yeah, going to get into game engines versus like a custom engine now. That I think tends to be like the biggest question that people ask, and that's even the question I'm trying to answer right now for my own game. Is like, do I use Unity or do I write my own custom C++ engine again? So I kind of want to just go over the pros and cons of those, um, and talk about them. So game engines, what are they good for? I think, I mean, it of course depends, but they typically have a kind of minor learning curve. It's not that bad. The upfront cost to getting things running is somewhat smaller. Um, and everything is kind of taken care of for you. You give updates. Hopefully, you're getting updates and bug fixes on a regular basis. That's something to kind of look for. And I should have mentioned this earlier. Honestly, is the like support for the application or whatever technology you're looking at. Is it being updated regularly? That is really important, because if you run into an issue with it, you find some bug or whatever, it would really suck if you're extremely committed to it and development stopped half a decade ago, and and especially if it's not open source, you're just like out of luck. Stuck with that bug forever, and if it's a crucial bug, then that can be really detrimental to your project. Um, yeah, so big pro, you get bug fixes and feature enhancements for free. There are lots and lots of features, especially for some of the game engines like Unity. They have just a plethora of features. Nice animations. You can do 3D or 2D. They have easy shader support. They have the shop that you can go to, or the store, and you can like get assets very easily, or features that you can just like drop into place. There's just so many features, analytics, and so on. Like the list goes on and on. Of course, the features differ from game engine to game engine, and I'm not going to kind of go over the game engines individually, because honestly, I don't really know all the pros and cons for them individually. That's something you can do, or you can hopefully find someone else doing for you. Um, And yeah, like I mentioned earlier about the whole community side of things, there's a good chance that other people will know the engine. So if you're planning on collaborating with people, or you are considering collaborating with people in the future, then if you use something like Unity, there's a really good chance that someone else is going to know how to use Unity, that you want to join your team. So I would say that's a pretty big pro. As for cons, though, the more unique your project is, the more you're going to have to fight the engine. I have seen many other indie game devs that have tried to make kind of unusual games, experimental games in Unity, and just struggle constantly with it because, Unity is set up to do a lot of things, um, and just do those things. And while they have been, continually improving on things over the years, it's still set up to work in its own way. And there's a lot of assumptions in place. And as soon as you start breaking those assumptions, you really have to work around, sidestep certain features or whatever. Like if you want to change the lighting system dramatically or whatever, like that can possibly prove to be a challenge. Or if you want to change the physics. And another con I would consider, a fairly large con, honestly, is that you kind of have to take all of the changes. You get all the bug fixes and the feature enhancements, which is great, but you also get changes that you might not want. Maybe they decided to rewrite the UI system. Well, guess what? You're kind of stuck with that. If your game has a very long development cycle, then you might go past their the amount of time that they're supporting that feature after it's been deprecated, and suddenly you're forced to use this new system, or you're forced to stay on some really old version of the engine, and you don't get bug fixes anymore. You don't get feature enhancements, which kind of takes away a large pro, I would say. And also, if you are developing a game and using a lot of custom changes to, let's say, their physics system or something, and then down the road they decide to change some fundamental aspects of the physics system that might not affect a lot of people or might not affect them at all, but for your game, since you are super physics heavy, it might completely screw up your physics system, and you have to rewrite it or do something. And maybe it doesn't even it happens gradually. Let's say you release your game on the Switch and everything is perfect, and then 10 years from now you're like, you know what, I think I want to release my game on the Switch 5 or whatever Nintendo calls one of their future consoles. And then you try to set it all up, and let's say best case scenario, Unity is supporting, or whatever game engine you are using is supporting this new console. Then that's great, but maybe some of the features that you were depending on are gone, or have dramatically changed, and suddenly your physics system doesn't work anymore. Another possible scenario is that, hey, you know what? Unity's gone, or whatever game engine is gone, or it's not available, it's not being updated anymore, and you can't even release the game on this new console. You would just have to rewrite the entire thing, which probably would not be cost effective. And that's typically one of the main motivators for re-releasing a game, is that it has a minimal upfront cost to hopefully get just a little bit more out of the game. So yeah, that if you're looking at games as far as a career, it can be a very big con to use a game engine, I think, just because of the uncertainty of where that game engine is going to be in the future. And yeah, there's also just a lot of game engines, some do have source access, and if you're big enough, sometimes even the larger ones, like I think Unity, you might be able to get source access. I'm not sure about that. But for the majority of us, we're not going to have source access to Unity. So if there's a bug that maybe is minor to the majority of people but really affects you, it might stick around for a while, and you're going to be stuck with that, and you have no choice. So that's kind of sucky. So yeah, that's game engines. So I want to now talk about custom engines. So this is where you are writing your own. It could be with monogame. It could be with C++. Monogame is C#. It could be with C++. It could be even with C. And pretty much anything else if you really want. So some of the pros for that, I think the biggest one is that, and this is also, well, I'll get into it. You have complete ownership over everything. You get to do whatever you want. You don't have to fight the systems or the features that are in the game engine because you are the one who's making them. And so you can kind of mold it to be exactly what you want. So you're not subject to any unwanted changes. You might be working with someone, but they're probably not going to be adding in features that you really don't want. Hopefully you are communicating and making sure that you're adding things that are really needed. So yeah, you're not really subject to those unwanted changes. And like I said, yeah, you can just build whatever you want. One, I think, I don't know if this is really considered a pro, but something to just keep in mind is that if you have a larger scope, if your game is like multiple years long, then that kind of helps mitigate that cost of developing an engine. Like if you're wanting to make a game in like a 3-month or a 6-month game, and then you decide you're going to make a game engine for it, and that takes you a year and a half or 2 years to make, that's a lot of development time. Whereas if you are making a 4-year project, then that whole like year and a half or whatever that you would be spending on the game engine might not be so bad. So game engine cons, just like a pro, it's also a con. You have complete ownership over everything. You have to do everything yourself. If there are any missing features or bugs, guess what? You get to fix them. Congratulations. You have to do it all. And yeah, they can take a lot of time to develop. Depending on your background, it might be fast, might not. For my own game, Korea, I spent probably 2 years where I was mostly just working on the game engine. I imagine I could do it quicker now, especially if I was making a similar game engine. Hopefully I can do it faster. I've learned a lot of the pitfalls that you need to avoid, as well as like some shortcuts. So yeah, there's that. And then kind of like the opposite of game engines is that for your own engine, no one's going to know how to use your own game engine because you wrote it. So if you're looking to like collaborate with someone, down the road, then there's going to be a lot more of a learning curve for that person to get started with your project. You can post a job listing saying, hey, we want a Unity developer, and you're going to be able to find a Unity developer. If you post something and you're like, hey, I want a developer for the Siege engine, no one's going to know how to use that because you wrote it. So that's just something else to keep in mind. There's a lot of probably other considerations that you want to make before you choose if you're doing your custom engine or a game engine. But hopefully this is kind of just like a good overview, maybe get your mind moving, thinking about these different things. But that's more or less the talk. So if you have any questions, now is a good time to ask, and I will read them aloud and then try to answer them. But yeah, so if you have questions, now is a good time. If I didn't answer any questions that you think are important, you can also bring those up and I'll do my best to answer it. I'll just give everyone a minute here since you have to type. No questions? No questions? Doesn't look like there are any questions. Well, I guess that means that I did an amazing job and answered every single possible question. That's great. Um, I highly doubt that. So again, yeah, if you are interested in uh, like learning more about how to choose the right technology for your projects, I recommend that you go um, seek others' advice as well. We have at least one question, maybe two here, so let me address those. Um, do you think if you use time management tools that would have helped you reduce the total time spent on the whole project? Time management tools. Do you mean like I think it's like Pomodoro or something like that with like the 30-minute, 10-minute break or whatever, 5-minute break? What do you mean like Trello? That's actually one tool that I used in development, and I do find that useful, and I want to use that, which is a Kanban board. Um, but yeah, I think managing your time or just like the overall project is definitely useful. Um, of course, again, it comes back to kind of the scope of the project. The larger the scope, the more important management is because it's very easy to become overwhelmed, especially like as development goes on. It might start simple where you're like, oh yeah, I'm just playing around with this one thing. But eventually you're going to get to the point where like if you're doing a commercial game, you're releasing it, you're like, okay, well now I need to figure out like what is the next update going to have? When are we going to be releasing that? What are the like features that are going into it? What is the content that's going into it? Maybe planning out several updates, making sure that they're kind of building on one another. Also dealing with like issues that are starting to come in. So um, I think that is really important. Any tool really, is it time management that is the problem, or scope creep? I think the majority of the time it's probably scope creep. I mean, sure, some of it is management, some of it's this learning curve overall. I think that I had to learn a lot of mistake, learn from a lot of mistakes through careers development. Um, just like what things should be prioritized, what shouldn't be. Very often, I think this is a common thing. People will decide that there's something that's really important and it needs to happen right then and right now, and then it ends up not being important whatsoever. I think like modding support was something that I was continuously pushing throughout careers development that ended up just like kind of flopping and not really being impactful. That if I had just like cut that out or de-emphasized that, I could have saved myself a significant amount of development time with basically little to no loss. But yeah, I think time management or just like management overall can absolutely help with making sure that you can keep on track. I know myself that if I know what I'm needing to work on and I have stuff laid out, it's much easier to, go from one thing to the next to the next to the next. Every single time you have to stop and ask yourself, what do I work on now? That is not just, wasted time that you're like thinking about things and you're having to reconsider a lot of stuff. Like, oh, do I prioritize this now or this other thing? Like, you should figure that up front. But also, it's opportunity for you to become distracted and, go onto Twitter or Facebook or whatever your platform, social media choices. Yeah. It seems like even with creating your own engine, that if you use any libraries and such, you can get locked into the upgrade bug fix problem, similar to using an engine, uh, and having to upgrade. Yes, you can, but it's I would say to a much smaller degree, um, where like you pick some logging. I mean, it depends, of course, on the like how fundamental the library is to your engine. So if you you pick some logging library, it's not going to have that much of an impact on you if it's not being updated, really. Of course, if you like your media library, like SDL or Monogame or SFML, if that stops being updated, then yeah, you can have problems. But fortunately, for the majority of those, they are open source. And so if you really need something fixed, you have that ability to go in and fix it or change it or add that feature. And you're not like completely subject to the original developer and what their like commitment to that project is. Japan, I will answer your question later. It doesn't really pertain to this talk, but I'm happy to answer it later. But thoughts on trying to commercial indie dev while having a full-time job? Yeah, Hamba. I guess I think that that pertains. So yeah, the question is, what are my thoughts on trying to make a commercial or become like a full time? I don't know if it's really become a full time. I guess it's really like trying to make a commercial game while having a full time job. That's it's tough. It's a lot of work. Um, I think that it's important to try to continue doing that until the game proves to be um like successful and enough to, if you really want to move forward or like move to working on it full time. I honestly probably jumped the gun with going full time for Korea. Fortunately, it worked out for me. I did actually at one point have to go back to my job and work there part time. Fortunately, they were very happy to have me back, and so that worked out. And at another point, I also ended up having to live with some family for a while. And so yeah, there's definitely a cost. It's called your living costs for working on a game. Um, and so yeah, I think it is important to continue to um, work full time while doing that. The unfortunate truth is that the majority of games fail and are not financially successful. If that's how you're measuring success. And so yeah, I think it's important to continue doing that. It's a lot of work. I don't really know what else to say about it. It's just like, if it's really important to you, then keep at it. Maybe try to find a support group or something. Um, or just like some community that you can be part of, such as maybe here. While you are doing that, because it's a long haul. Whenever you're working, especially if you're by yourself and you're doing full-time development. Yeah. Any other questions? If things had not worked out, what would you have done with Korea's development? I probably would have tried getting a job at a studio. I think that's what the majority of indie games do, or indie devs do now. If things don't work out, you go work at somewhere else that has a little bit more security. I'm not really sure. One of my friends does web development, and I would really like to collaborate with him. He's a very driven, passionate guy, and while web development isn't really my passion, I think that working with him would be awesome, and it probably would be worthwhile doing. So I really don't know. There's a lot of possibilities. But yeah, probably working at a game studio somewhere. Hey, Angry Joe, welcome. One thing you really get stuck on for developing a game is graphics. Do you have any ideas how I overcome that? Like, are you talking about actually creating the graphics yourself, or like getting someone else to do the graphics for you? Like, that's kind of separate than this talk. This talk is about choosing the technology for your project. Um, and yeah, I would just say for that, getting like if you want to be self, uh, what's the word? If you want to just like do everything yourself, self-sufficient. There we go. Then I would recommend just like doing something like Pixel Dailies, which is a Twitter account that gives you a theme every day. And I'm sure there are similar themes for other types of art. Um, and just like slowly growing your skills. And if you're looking for artists, I would say, building a prototype, something that you can show off to prove to someone that it's worth their time investing in your own project. Yeah. Yep. So I think that sounds like it's the end of the questions. That's last question. Okay. No problem, Hambone. Did you ever have any motivational issues while working on Korea or any other projects, past and present? I will answer that question after this. I want to try to wrap up this talk here and put it up on YouTube. So I'm going to do that. So let me just close out, and then I'll answer any other questions that don't necessarily pertain to this talk. So yeah, thank you all for joining. Again, like I said, go get other people advice as well. I am just one guy with limited experience, single perspective. So thank you all for tuning in and listening. I hope that you did find this talk useful. And if you have any other questions, you're always welcome to join my Twitch channel, which is twitch.tv/siegegames, where I stream pretty much every day. And you can come ask questions about this talk or anything else related to game development. And yeah, thank you for joining.